Hello friends, thanks for joining us for our livestock market report. We've got a lot to cover today. Cattle markets are on quite the roller coaster in the month of April, so we're going to look at the futures and the cash trade. Definitely talk about the run these grain markets have been on. We'll look at a few local auction markets from across the region, and we'll wrap up looking at the long-range weather forecast with meteorologist Don Day. First off though, have to give a big thank you to our friends at Ag Risk Advisors for continuing to sponsor these reports. We've had a lot of fun putting them together, so hopefully you're finding value out of these. You know, now that we're on the back end of the calving season, if you're thinking about marketing this year's calf crop, reach out to Ag Risk Advisors. Check out their website lrpadvisors.com and sign up for their daily LRP rates email. Livestock risk protection is a great, cost-effective way to manage price risk. Again, check it out at lrpadvisors.com. Now to our markets. Cattle markets really were following their seasonal trend that we typically see. Feeders reached their high in early April, as they usually do, but when they came down, they really did. Probably don't have to tell you what caused that. Sharply higher grain prices have really created concerns about feed costs, and costs of gain definitely increasing. Spot corn actually got over $7 a bushel, increasing over $1 in April alone. We're talking nearly a 100% increase since last August. That's due in part to demand from China, lower supplies, drought in both the U.S. and competitor Brazil, and maybe a little bit of concern and affecting market sentiments on federal climate change policy. Those higher grain prices did really kick the feeder cattle in the teeth. The May contract fell more than $15 from its highs, back now to the lowest point since early November. However, deferred feeder cattle contracts held up much better, dropping more like $9 to $10. June live cattle futures did fall about $10, but cash trade performing much better, getting up to $122 on a live basis and $195 on the rail. Now those prices did fall back at the end of the month, but still holding up relatively well as the basis has turned positive. Box beef has really increased, up $42 in the month of April. That's a 17% increase. So beef demand is pretty strong, especially as the food service demand picks up and grilling season begins as well. The challenge continues to be large fed cattle supplies and poor leverage. Carcass weights are still elevated, and we've just got a lot of harvest-ready cattle in the feed yards, but that situation should begin to change. Feeders outside of feedlots are down 700,000 head when compared with a year ago, so going forward we should see placements into feed yards moving lower as we get into the fall. Hopefully that will help feeder markets and maybe even line up with the fall calf run, but really until this grain market at least moves lower or, stabilizes would be nice, that is going to put pressure on the feeder cattle futures. We've definitely seen that pressure at our local auction markets here over the last month. At Stockman's Livestock Exchange, we saw a lot more heifers sell, as just not many being kept as replacements or carried over on grass. Bigger 5-weight heifers sold from 154 to 161, lighter 6-weights 148 to 151, and 7-weight heifers mostly 124 to 132. It does seem like we're seeing a lot more pairs selling. The public auction yards in Billings held a cow-calf pair and bred cow special and actually saw pretty good demand considering the drought concerns. The young pair sold primarily from $1,600 to $1,800, topping out at $1,875, middle-aged pairs from $1,400 to $1,600, and solid-mouth pairs $1,300 to $1,400. Cull cow markets have held up relatively well. We've seen some pressure due to the higher corn, but in Brush, Colorado, we saw the cull cows selling mostly 64 to 72 cents, topping out at 76.5. Thinner cows brought 56 to 62, and the heiferettes ranging 87 cents up to $1.10. Certainly the biggest worry on the minds of producers across the West, though, is drought. Rain was spotty at best through the month of April, and it's created concerns about forage production this year, and it may require some producers to manage their herd size lower and just not carry as many yearlings through the summer and maybe sell some cows too. So to get a look at the long-range weather forecast, I spoke with meteorologist Don Day. As we're getting into May, it's a critical time for moisture, and so I asked Don for his outlook for the rest of the spring and summer on what we can expect for precipitation.
I always call May the money month when it comes to precipitation in the Western High Plains and Rockies. If you look statistically, May is usually the wettest month on average. It's some areas of the Western United States and the Central Plains get 25 to 30% of their annual precipitation in May. So to your point, if you don't have that moisture by June 1st, you're going to be hurting through the summer.
Unfortunately, Don says dry conditions are likely to stay with us.
The bad news is that it looks like we're going to continue to have a weak La Nina. That's basically when the subtropical Pacific is a little bit colder than normal. And that leads to less precipitation, especially in the western United States. And that's exactly what we experienced in the spring and summer of 2020 through the winter. It looks like that's going to continue.
The next 30 days looks pretty dry for most of the West, but Don says it's possible the dry La Nina conditions start to lift.
The good news is this: the La Nina pattern is weaker than it was last spring going into summer of 2020, which lends itself to the argument that we may be drier than normal this spring and summer again for the second year in a row, which we really don't like to see. However, it may not be as severe as from what we saw in 2020. This is likely going to end up being a 2-year La Nina.
So this weather pattern is actually pretty similar to what we saw a decade ago. It's expected to stay dry across the West and into the Midwest through the summer.
Most La Ninas only last a year. But one thing we have seen about every 10 or 11 years or so, we tend to get back-to-back La Ninas that can be severe. And if you go back to 2011, 2012, when the last time this happens, and a lot of us remember how dry of a period that was, and this is sort of repeating itself, the same pattern.
Well, coming out of that 2012 drought, we entered a pretty profitable time frame in the cattle industry, so hopefully we see that market develop again. The situation does seem to be getting a bit more dire when it comes to moisture, though. Soil moisture is practically non-existent through a lot of the region. Don says there's still time for it to get better, though. We just have to get that moisture that is always critical in the month of May.
You know, there's been some help, but boy, you look at North Dakota and parts of South Dakota, Montana, many areas of Wyoming, many areas of Colorado. We're still in drought situations, but keep a really close eye on those first 2 weeks of May. That's a barometer. If May can end up being more stormy, the forecast for the summer certainly gets more optimistic.
We'll be watching the forecast very closely, praying for rain clouds. To stay up to date on the weather forecast, visit agriskadvisors.com. Don produces a weekly weather forecast and it's pretty valuable, providing a lot of insight, so check that out. And before we go, I do want to mention that Ag Risk Advisors are excited to announce that they've got a new Ag Risk portal that they're releasing. In the Ag Risk portal, anyone interested in learning about ranch risk management can view the most recent rainfall index data or view their LRP daily rates. If you don't have a policy, it's not a problem. Ag Risk Advisors is set up to provide ranchers with the most relevant risk management information, regardless of whether you're a current customer or not. To begin tracking a coverage example for your operation, call Ag Risk Advisors at 833-393-1088 or visit them at agriskadvisors.com. That's all for this month's Livestock Market Report. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you down the trail.